particular part of Gujarat is called Saurashtra, which basically means 100 states. There were 260 princely states just in Gujarat. You know, some of them, as you mentioned, William, were just a bunch of little acres. Some of them had a few villages, and they were independent rulers. So how do you put them all together? And so they came up with this solution called the Kathiawar Western Agency states, and then they broke them down in terms of ranks, in terms of gun salutes, in terms of all kinds of things. But coming to my book, it's a personal story. It's a story of what this particular family went through, during a period of about 70 odd years. And at the heart of this is Surat, which I grew up in between Bombay and Surat, and every time I would go to Surat with my grandfather, he would hand me, and he would take it back. Obviously, he would hand me a book which was Debate in the House of Commons, 1857, and it was the minutes of the debate that one of our ancestors had in the House of Commons, and he would say, "This is going to change your life." And then every time we returned from Surat, he would grab it back and take it back, But the one thing that he would always say when we went to Surat was, this was India's greatest port. This was a port that was bursting with color and fragrance, and the most incredible bazaars that surrounded the docks, and you had Arabs trading there, and the Portuguese, and all kinds of people. And when I would look at Surat, back in the 80s, I would say, "Good God, really, is this? It can't be that. Please, let's just go back to Bombay."
Place where bubonic plague.
Exactly. But then, as time passed, and I moved to England. Before he passed away, my grandfather, he gave me this book, which was the minutes in the House of Commons in 1857, and I sat down and I read it, and it was astonishing, and it took me back to do more research in Surat. And what I realized was that so much had been written about the fall of many states. For example, a lot has been written about Awadh, and how Awadh was taken over, and how
Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, the
yes,
expert,
exactly, yes, of course. A lot has been written about this iconic clash between Tipu and Richard Wellesley, and how Mysore was annexed, and all of these incredible stories of how these states were annexed. But nothing was written about Surat. No one really knew what happened to Surat. How did Surat fall, and what was this thing that happened in the House of Commons? Anyways, as I was researching, I realized that this was an incredible story. The story begins in 1733, when the Mughal Empire is floundering. It's virtually, its decline has begun. Aurangzeb is dead in 1707, and Surat, which is this incredible port, is at the crossroads of its own destiny. And the East India Company is there. They had landed in 1612. They are very much a potent force there. They're itching to take Surat over. The Marathas are lurking in the shadows. They're constantly trying to take Surat.
Shivaji 3 times.
Shivaji in the 1600s has raided Surat, but it's still standing. It's still a thriving port. It's still a port which is colourful, and trade is prospering. And in all of this, the Surat Nawabs declare independence. The first Nawab is a guy called Teghbakh Khan, and he has this vision of a unified command, because the Mughals were very smart. They broke Surat and they had a divided rule. It was Castle, which was governed by the Abyssinian Sidis, and the civil administration was with a Mutasaddi or a clerk. And Teghbakh Khan is the first Nawab who brings it all together under one unified command, because he sees that there's a direct threat of an East India Company or a Dutch invasion, and because of that there should be a unified command. So he takes over the castle, he puts the Sidi under him, and he brings about this unified command of Surat. And Surat somehow starts to prosper again.
While the British were doing classes in 1757?
Yes, this is 1733.
Right.
But with the death of Teghbakh Khan, there is a certain vacuum once again that is created in Surat. And Nawab Muinuddin, who's his son-in-law, takes charge. However, it's kind of too late, because it's large parts of India are already kind of seeking independence, but the East India Company is on their borders. And in 1759, the company actually attacks the castle. Now, not very many people know that it was a forceful, virtual forceful invasion of Surat. And the castle falls after Nawab Moinuddin and the Sidi put up a united front. The battle lasts for, I think, about a couple of days, but they are beaten, and the castle falls. But Nawab Moinuddin refuses to open the city gates, and he says there is no way that you're going to take the city. And the city then comes to, you know, there's this point where it could actually go up in flames if there's a forceful invasion of the city. Finally, an agreement is reached that the Nawabship will continue in terms of administration of the city, and the castle will remain with the East India Company. But I'll cut to 1800. It's 1800. The Nawab Nizamuddin, who's the grandson of Moinuddin, dies, and immediately after his death, his infant son also dies. And so Richard Wellesley, who's the Governor General of Hindustan at that time, he's brimming with confidence because he's beaten Tipu, and Surat is there for the taking because there's no male heir. What he doesn't realize is that there is a younger brother of Nizamuddin who can succeed. But Wellesley goes in and threatens forceful invasion of the city if Nizamuddin doesn't sign a treaty. And what is the treaty? The treaty is that Nizamuddin would be allowed to keep his title of the Nawab. He would be paid £15,000 a year, and he would be allowed to keep his private estates, which includes his own private property, his palaces, his orchards, his gardens, and all of that. Nasiruddin he contemplates street fighting, but it's useless. You can't match Wellesley's army at that time, because by then the East India Company is all powerful and brimming with confidence. So he signs these papers, and Surat has finally fallen. So Surat finally falls in 1800 with this treaty that is signed with the Nawab. But I think what actually befalls the family now is a real example of the treachery of the East India Company. Within 42 years, the treaty is violated, and it's violated again because the last Nawab has left behind a daughter and 2 granddaughters. But before his death, the Nawab has appointed his daughter his successor. He has ordered the firing of the cannons, which is a symbol of appointing of a successor. During the Bismillah ceremony, where it is a ceremony in the Muslims where they actually start reading alphabets, he announces in public that she is going to be his successor. Sir John Malcolm, who is the governor of Bombay, has attended this lavish ceremony and has actually taken the daughter in his own lap and announced to everyone that she will be the successor. So East India Company actually acknowledges her as a successor. But there's something in the Nawab's mind which is keeping him, which is making him uneasy, and there's something which is not right, and so he starts looking for a son-in-law, because he has no uncles, he has no cousins, and he has no brothers, and he knows that if he dies, the house would be a house of just women, and that could fall and capsize quite quickly. Now these estates are worth millions. They're about 3 palaces. A third of Surat is the private property of the Nawab, and the company is very much there on the lookout. So finally, he calls these 2 Mughal princes from Delhi, who he wants his daughters to get married to, Mirza Najaf and another Mirza Humayun. But they come to Surat and fling themselves into the pleasures of the city. They go to all the possible brothels, get drunk, and find themselves in opium dens, and he rejects them. Finally, there is one prince from a very tiny principality in Kathiawar called Kamandia. And this man is the son of a warrior who's also a fighter on behalf of the Maharaja of Baroda. And he picks this man to become the last custodian of his house. He comes in and he marries the daughter. All seems fine, but then the Nawab dies. Now the minute the Nawab dies, the English East India Company refuses to recognize the daughter as a successor, refuses to recognize the adopted son-in-law, who's been adopted legally as the male heir, as the successor, stops the family's income of £15,000 a year, and brutally raids all the palaces and the estates and takes them over. And that leaves the granddaughters and this family on the brink of destitution. There's absolutely nothing to kind of live off, and they're confined to a one-bedroom apartment at the corner of Hashmat Mahal, which is the palace that was usurped. And this is when the book kind of turns, because it's about now this prince who is left with no option but to fight the East India Company. He's luckily the son of a reasonably wealthy small little prince, because he's quite cash rich. So he pumps in the money to keep this little bit of an estate that he's been able to hold alive. But now remember, this is all happening before 1848, before the official doctrine of lapse. And the person who's doing this is Lord Ellenborough. So he's stopped the pension, he's usurped the estates, and he's left the family on the brink of destitution. But in an unprecedented counterattack, this prince, whose name is Mir Jafar Ali Khan, he decides not to challenge the East India Company in India, but to take them on in Britain. And this is an unprecedented act. I mean, a reasonable amount of princes had come to Britain. Some of them had come to see, for sightseeing. A large number of them had come just to complain meekly about what the company was doing. But this man comes with a plan. He wants to meet the movers and shakers in Britain and tell them about what's going on in India and what the East India Company is doing. So he lands up in 1844 in Britain with this entourage of his. He's got a translator called Lutfullah, who's more interested in the blonde-haired English beauties rather than putting his papers together for his prince and all of these kind of things. And he comes to meet the chairman of the company. The meeting with the chairman goes off reasonably all right. The chairman kind of says this is flagrant injustice. But the deputy chairman of the company, John Wilcox, actually overrules the chairman and prevents the succession to happen and prevents the release of the estates. And basically at this time in England, all hope is lost. But there's one particular meeting that changes things. Scott is another secretary of his, and he says, listen, I'll get you into Ascot. And I want you to go to Ascot, and I'll get you a box which is relatively close to a relatively powerful box, and that's the box of Queen Victoria and Albert. So go there dressed in your robes and your turbans and all of that, and let's see what comes of it. So he lands up sitting in this box, and inadvertently, Victoria looks at him. And during the break in Ascot, as there's a break during the in the racing, he's standing, and Victoria and Albert are at a distance, and she makes it a point to tell Albert that I want to walk towards this Indian Oriental. And that's the point in time when he is told by his secretary that if you even get 10 seconds, just tell her what you've come here for. And he gets exactly that. He gets barely about 15-20 seconds, and he tells her about the reason why he's here. Now I think that is the moment of change in his life, because Albert then tells him, listen, I want you to come to this particular event that is happening at the Royal Society of Arts, and I want to introduce you to someone. This is done rather tacitly because Victoria and Albert cannot be seen as supporting an Indian in Victorian England. Once again, just remember, this is 1844. The doctrine of lapse hasn't yet officially kicked in India, but it's happened to the Surat family. Anyway, so he goes to the Royal Society of Arts, and he's made to sit next to Prince Albert, and he's made to give out all the kinds of gifts for all these incredible discoveries that Britain is doing. And at the end of the evening, Albert introduces him to the most powerful lawmaker in Britain. And this man's name is Sir Richard Bethel. And finally, he meets Richard Bethel. Richard Bethel takes on his case, but he fails in 1844. He comes back to India. He mortgages all that his father has, all the lands, the orchards, and he goes back to England in 1853. Richard Bethel and Sir Fitzroy Kelly, who's the Solicitor General, take on his case, and for the first time an Indian enters the Houses of Parliament in 1853 to actually table a bill for the reinstatement of the estates. It's the first time an Indian has entered Parliament, and his bill is fought by East India Company MPs who want to ensure that the bill doesn't pass. It's a nail-biting finish, and in the end, it's the first time that a bill passes. 213 ayes in favor of an Indian and 28 noes against the East India Company. And it's the only time the East India Company is defeated in their own parliament. So that's the story.
Have you sold the film rights?
No, not
I can find you an agent.
I forgot to mention one thing. He does fall in love with an English actress.
Hey.
But I'll let does he take her back to India?
A couple of questions to all of you before we open it up. First of all, there's a big difference between the places where the British ruled for 150, 200 years, like Bengal, where a lot of the princely states are swept away, and you lose the traditions of, say, miniature painting, of oral histories, of sometimes architectural traditions, and so on. And against that, somewhere like Rajasthan, where these things continue right up until the 1970s, and where lineages of painters and architects and oral historians and bards and things like. How important do you all think the cultural role of the Maharajas were keeping the traditional arts of India going?
Well, just a quick point on this really, which is simply, yes, of course, we can